Imagine this. You wake tomorrow morning and discover that every wound you've ever carried, every betrayal that left you questioning your worth, every rejection that taught you to shrink yourself, every moment of humiliation that still flashes through your mind at 3 in the morning has lost its power. Not because you've forgotten, not because time finally healed what it promised to heal, but because something fundamental has shifted in the architecture of your consciousness. The pain still exists in memory, yes, but it no longer inhabits you. It no longer dictates how you move through the world, who you trust, what you dare to want, or who you're afraid to become. Today, we'll journey through that truth led by the insights of Carl Jung and others who dared to go deeper into the soul of humanity. Stay with me, because in the final part of this journey, we will unveil the most powerful realization of all, one that could completely redefine the way you see pain, yourself, and your place in the world. Carl Jung, the renowned Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, dedicated his life to exploring the unseen depths of the human psyche. He believed that most suffering arises not from the world outside, but from the parts of ourselves we repress, ignore, or fear. He called this the shadow, the hidden self we avoid facing. And yet, it is within this very shadow that our power resides. Why? Because what we refuse to face controls us, but what we integrate transforms us. Jung didn't promise a life without pain. Before we dive deeper, take a moment to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with others who might be searching for deeper meaning in their own lives. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your reflections matter. Now hold that image. Feel into it. What would change if the past could no longer ambush you? If criticism rolled off you like water off stone? If abandonment, mockery, and disappointment became nothing more than weather temporary, external, incapable of reaching whatever it is inside you that remains untouched? Here's the paradox that should unsettle you. We spend our entire lives building defenses against being hurt, yet those very defenses guarantee our continued suffering. We construct walls, rehearse responses, avoid vulnerability, curate personas, and still someone says the wrong thing at the wrong moment, and we crumble. The armor we forge from our wounds becomes the prison we inhabit. We think we're protecting ourselves, but what if we're only protecting the wound? What if the thing we're most afraid of losing is the very thing that keeps us captive? Carl Jung understood something that most people spend their entire lives refusing to see. The greatest threats to your peace don't come from the cruelty of others or the chaos of the world. They come from the parts of yourself you've never had the courage to face. Every insult that lands, every rejection that devastates, every betrayal that shatters, these don't create new wounds. They press on fractures that already existed, carved into you long before you developed the language to name them. Consider this carefully. When someone criticizes you and it ruins your day, is it really their words that hurt? Or is it the way those words confirm a secret verdict you've already passed on yourself? When someone leaves and you feel destroyed, is it truly their absence that devastates? Or is it the ancient terror that you were never enough to make anyone stay? The world doesn't hurt you. The world reveals you. It shows you where you've abandoned yourself, where you've left doors unlocked, where you're still bleeding from battles you thought you'd survived. This is the question that should haunt you. What if you've been wounded not by what happened to you, but by what you decided it meant? What if every moment of suffering is actually a moment of mistaken interpretation, a story you told yourself about your worthlessness, your unworthiness, your fundamental inadequacy, and you've been living inside that story ever since, calling it reality? Jung spoke of the shadow, the parts of ourselves we reject, deny, repress into darkness. But here's what they don't tell you about the shadow. It isn't made of your flaws. It's made of your disowned power. Every time you were told you were too much or not enough, every time you learned that certain parts of you were unacceptable, you didn't eliminate those parts. You buried them. And now they control you from beneath the surface. Puppet strings attached to every trigger, every overreaction, every inexplicable spiral into self-loathing. You think you're afraid of being hurt again. But what you're really afraid of is discovering that you've been hurting yourself all along. That the cruelest voice in your life has always been your own. That you've been the abandoner, the critic, the one who decided you weren't worth defending. So here's the uncomfortable truth that must be spoken before we go any further. No one can hurt you anymore because no one ever could. Not really. Not in the way you think. They could only ever illuminate what you already believed about yourself, in the darkness where you couldn't see it. And if that's true, if the source of your suffering has always been internal, then something else must also be true. You hold the power to end it. Not someday. Not when you're healed enough, or strong enough, or worthy enough. Now, in this moment, by choosing to see what you've been refusing to see. But that choice requires something from you that you might not be ready to give, the willingness to stop being a victim of your own story. Let me ask you something that will disturb you if you answer honestly. How many times have you reacted with rage, devastation, or collapse only to realize hours or days later that the real battle wasn't with the person in front of you, but with something ancient and unresolved inside you? That argument with your partner that spiraled out of control over unwashed dishes. Was it really about the dishes? Or was it about the childhood pattern of feeling unseen, unheard, dismissed? That crushing feeling when someone doesn't text you back, is it truly about their silence? Or is it about the terror of abandonment you've carried since you were too young to understand why someone you loved chose to leave? This is where Jung's psychology becomes radical, even dangerous to the ego's carefully constructed defenses. He understood that we don't experience reality directly, we experience it through the lens of our unconscious. Every perception is filtered through years of accumulated wounds, unspoken beliefs, and buried emotions. You think you're responding to what's happening now, but you're actually responding to what happened then. The past doesn't stay in the past. It colonizes the present, turning every new experience into an echo of old pain. Jung called this phenomenon projection. We project onto others the qualities, judgments, and characteristics that we cannot accept in ourselves. The person who enrages you, they're likely embodying something you've disowned. The criticism that destroys you, it's confirming a judgment you've already made about yourself in the dark. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this when he wrote, "That which we do not bring to consciousness appears in our lives as fate." You think life keeps happening to you, but life is actually revealing you to yourself, showing you the precise locations of your unhealed fractures. Consider the architecture of suffering itself. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps, discovered something that should shake your understanding of pain. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies your freedom, your power to choose your response. But here's what Frankl understood that most people miss. That space only exists if you're conscious. If you're unconscious, ruled by your wounds, driven by your shadow, controlled by your past, then there is no space. There is only automatic reaction, the predictable pattern, the same suffering on repeat. This is the hidden problem that no one wants to name. You're not suffering because of what happened to you. You're suffering because of what you're still doing with what happened to you. You're suffering because you've built an entire identity around your wounds. You've become so identified with your pain that healing feels like dying. Who would you be without your stories of victimhood? Without your justified resentments? Without the comfortable familiarity of your suffering? Jean-Paul Sartre said we are condemned to be free, and he meant it as both liberation and burden. You cannot escape the responsibility of your own consciousness. You cannot outsource your healing. You cannot wait for the world to become safe enough, kind enough, fair enough before you choose to be whole. The world will never be those things. But you can become unbreakable anyway, not through hardness, but through awareness. Arthur Schopenhauer understood that suffering is intrinsic to existence itself, woven into the fabric of wanting, desiring, and lacking. But he also understood something crucial. Representation is everything. The way you represent your experience to yourself determines whether you suffer or transcend. Two people experience the same event. One is destroyed, the other is transformed. The difference isn't in what happened. It's in the meaning they assigned to what happened. The story they told themselves about what it revealed about their worth, their future, their fundamental nature. This is the psychological trap that keeps you imprisoned. You believe your interpretations are facts. You believe your emotional reactions are evidence of truth. You believe that because you feel unworthy, you must be unworthy. But feelings are not facts. They're messengers from the unconscious, carrying information about unintegrated experiences. When you feel disproportionately hurt by something small, your psyche is trying to show you where you're still wounded. The trigger isn't the problem. It's the breadcrumb leading you home to yourself. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Every person who has ever hurt you was also acting from their own unconscious wounds. This doesn't excuse them, but it releases you from the prison of personalizing their actions. They weren't rejecting you because you're fundamentally unlovable. They were projecting their own self-rejection onto you. They weren't abandoning you because you're not enough. They were fleeing their own inability to be present with intimacy. When you understand this, truly understand it, resentment becomes impossible. Not because you've become passive, but because you've seen through the illusion that their actions were ever really about you. But what happens when you don't see through the illusion? What happens when you continue living as though your wounds are your identity, your past is your destiny, and your pain is proof of who you are? The consequences are far more devastating than you realize, and they operate in the shadows, reshaping your entire reality without your conscious awareness. First, understand this. Your nervous system keeps the score. Bessel van der Kolk's research revealed what ancient wisdom always knew: trauma lives in the body, not just the mind. Every unprocessed wound creates a neurological pathway, a hair trigger response embedded in your physiology. Your body learns to anticipate pain before your mind even registers the threat. Someone raises their voice, and your heart rate spikes. Someone goes quiet, and your chest tightens. You're not being dramatic or oversensitive. You're being hijacked by a nervous system that never received the signal that the danger has passed. This is the unseen prison. You walk through life in a state of perpetual bracing. You're not present in the moment because you're busy scanning for threats, preparing for betrayal, armoring against the next wound. Intimacy becomes impossible because vulnerability feels like handing someone a loaded weapon. Opportunity becomes terrifying because success means visibility, and visibility means exposure to judgment. You settle for less love, less joy, less aliveness, because staying small feels safer than risking the pain of being seen and rejected. But here's the darker consequence that nobody talks about. You become the very thing you fear. Jung called this enantiodromia, the tendency of things to transform into their opposites. The person terrified of abandonment becomes clingy, pushing others away through desperation. The person afraid of being controlled becomes controlling, micromanaging every detail to avoid vulnerability. The person wounded by criticism becomes hypercritical, projecting their self-judgment onto everyone around them. You don't just carry your wounds, you inflict them on others, perpetuating the very cycles you swore you'd break. Consider the cognitive architecture of this trap. Confirmation bias ensures that you see only evidence that supports your unconscious beliefs. If you believe you're unworthy, your mind will filter reality to prove it. 10 people compliment you, 1 person criticizes you, and guess which interaction your mind obsesses over? The criticism. Not because it's more true, but because it confirms the story you've been telling yourself in the dark. Your perception becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, constructing a reality that validates your deepest fears. This is how trauma perpetuates itself across lifetimes. You don't consciously choose to recreate your pain, you unconsciously gravitate toward familiar patterns because the known, even when it hurts, feels safer than the unknown. You choose partners who replicate your childhood wounds. You enter situations that trigger your abandonment patterns. You sabotage opportunities that threaten to prove your unworthiness wrong. And then you wonder why life keeps happening to you. Why the same painful patterns repeat endlessly. Why healing seems impossible. The cultural dimension makes it worse. We live in a society that profits from your wounds. Social media algorithms feed on your insecurities, turning comparison into currency. Consumer culture sells you products to fix the brokenness it convinced you to believe in. Political tribalism exploits your fear of the other, channeling your unprocessed shadow into collective rage. You're not just battling your personal unconscious, you're swimming in a collective unconscious that actively reinforces your suffering. And here's the consequence that should terrify you most. Time doesn't heal these wounds. Time merely buries them deeper. You think you've moved on because you don't think about it anymore. But the body remembers. The nervous system remembers. The unconscious remembers. And 20 years later, something small happens, a tone of voice, a particular look, a moment of silence, and you're transported back to that moment of original wounding, feeling everything you thought you'd left behind. This is why middle-aged people suddenly collapse under the weight of decades-old pain. The wound was never healed. It was just waiting. You cannot outrun your shadow. You cannot positive think your way past unintegrated trauma. You cannot manifest abundance while unconsciously believing you deserve punishment. The unexamined wound doesn't disappear, it metastasizes, spreading into every corner of your life, dictating your choices, limiting your possibilities, ensuring that you remain trapped in patterns you can't even see. So how do you break free from a prison you can't see? How do you escape patterns that operate beneath the threshold of your awareness? The answer is not what you expect, and it requires something from you that every part of your conditioned self will resist. You must turn toward the wound, not away from it. This is the great rebellion, the counterintuitive path that Jung mapped but few have the courage to walk. When something triggers you, your instinct is to defend, deflect, or distract. You blame the other person. You rationalize your reaction. You numb yourself with work, substances, scrolling, anything to avoid feeling the full weight of what's been activated. But every time you do this, you abandon yourself. You reinforce the pattern. You tell your unconscious that this wound is too dangerous to touch, and it grows stronger in the darkness. The path of integration demands the opposite. Stop, breathe, feel. When that familiar rage rises, when that crushing shame descends, when that terror of abandonment grips your chest instead of running, ask yourself, what is this really about? What old wound is speaking through this present moment? This is not analysis. This is not intellectualization. This is direct confrontation with the parts of yourself you've spent a lifetime avoiding. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of becoming whole by integrating the shadow, the rejected and repressed aspects of the self. But understand what this actually means in practice. You must sit with the part of you that believes you're worthless and ask it where it learned that lie. You must meet the rage you've been suppressing and let it tell you what boundary was violated, what need went unmet, what injustice remains unacknowledged. You must face the shame that keeps you small and trace it back to the moment someone convinced you that who you are is fundamentally wrong. This work is not comfortable. It's excavation. You're digging through layers of conditioning, false beliefs, and protective mechanisms to find the original wound beneath the scar tissue. And when you find it, when you finally see the frightened child who decided they weren't enough, the betrayed adolescent who learned trust is dangerous, the silenced soul who concluded their voice doesn't matter, something extraordinary happens. The wound loses its power. Not because it disappears, but because you've finally witnessed it with consciousness instead of unconscious reaction. Viktor Frankl discovered this in the death camps. The one freedom that cannot be taken is the freedom to choose your response, to decide what meaning you will make of your suffering. But that freedom only exists when you're aware, when you can observe your pain without being consumed by it, when you can feel the emotion without believing it's the whole truth. This is the space between stimulus and response, and it's where your liberation lives. Now consider the radical implications. If your suffering comes from unconscious identification with your wounds, then healing comes from conscious disidentification. You are not your trauma. You are not your shame. You are not your fear. You are the awareness that can observe all of these things. This shift from being your story to witnessing your story changes everything. The pain doesn't vanish, but your relationship to it transforms. You stop collapsing into it. You stop letting it dictate who you can become. But this requires daily practice, moment-to-moment vigilance. Every time you notice a reaction that seems disproportionate, that's your invitation. Every time you catch yourself in an old pattern, that's your opportunity. The work is not to never feel triggered, it's to catch yourself faster, to bring awareness to the unconscious more quickly, to choose your response more consciously. Over time, the triggers lose their charge, not because you've built better walls, but because you've healed the wounds they were pressing on. This is how you reclaim your power, not by controlling the external world, but by mastering your internal world. Not by demanding that others stop hurting you, but by healing the places where hurt can still penetrate. Not by waiting for life to become easier, but by becoming someone for whom life's difficulties no longer define them. You stop being a victim of circumstance and become the author of your experience, not by changing what happens, but by changing what it means. Now we arrive at the truth that changes everything, the realization that cannot be unseen once you've glimpsed it. Everything we've explored, the shadow, the unconscious wounds, the patterns of suffering, the path of integration, has been leading to this singular, revolutionary insight. You are not who you think you are. And in that discovery lies your absolute freedom. Stay with me here, because this is where psychology dissolves into something deeper, where Jung's work touches the eternal truths that every mystic, sage, and enlightened being has pointed toward across centuries. The person you believe yourself to be, the one with the history, the wounds, the personality, the story, is a construction. It's a narrative woven from memory, conditioned beliefs, and accumulated experiences. It feels real. It feels solid. It feels like you. But it's not. It's a character you've been playing so convincingly that you forgot you were acting. Jung understood this when he distinguished between the ego and the self. The ego is the constructed identity, your name, your roles, your self-image, your wounds. It's the part that gets offended, that needs validation, that fears rejection. But beneath and beyond the ego lies the self, the vast, unchanging awareness that witnesses all of this without being touched by it. This self has never been wounded because it cannot be wounded. It has never been rejected because it exists prior to any concept of acceptance or rejection. It simply is. This is the truth that should shake you to your core. No one and nothing can hurt you anymore because there is no separate, isolated you to hurt. There is only awareness, consciousness, presence, call it what you will experiencing itself through the temporary form you call yourself. The wounds you carry, the pain you've endured, the suffering you've identified with, these belong to the ego, the constructed self. But you are not the ego. You are the space in which the ego appears. Consider what this means practically. When someone criticizes you and you feel devastated, who is devastated? Is it the awareness observing the criticism? No. The awareness simply notices. There is devastation arising. The devastation belongs to the ego, structure, to the self-concept that has invested in being seen a certain way. But if you can observe the devastation, if you can witness the feeling without being consumed by it, then you are not the feeling. You are the witness of the feeling. And the witness is untouchable. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor philosopher, understood this when he wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." But he was pointing at something even deeper than mental discipline. He was pointing at the recognition that you are not your mind. You are the power that can observe the mind, question the mind, choose which thoughts to believe and which to release. This is sovereignty. This is liberation. The Buddhist tradition calls it anatta, no self. Not that you don't exist, but that the separate, isolated, wounded self you believe yourself to be is an illusion. Vedanta calls it Atman, the eternal witness, the unchanging consciousness behind all changing phenomena. Christian mystics spoke of dying to the false self, to be reborn in Christ consciousness. Different languages, same truth. The person you think you are is not the totality of what you are. And here's where it becomes practical, immediate, life-altering. Every moment of suffering is an opportunity to ask, who is suffering? Sit with that question. Don't answer it intellectually. Feel into it. When you say, "I am hurt," who is the I? Can you find it? Can you locate this separate self that's been wounded? Or do you find only awareness, watching thoughts about being hurt, noticing sensations of hurt, observing the story of hurt, but never actually finding the hurt self? This is the great undoing. This is what Jung meant when he said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Not to become something new, but to recognize what you've always been beneath the layers of conditioning and identity. You don't become invulnerable by hardening yourself. You become invulnerable by realizing there's nothing to protect. The fortress you've been defending doesn't contain your true nature, it conceals it. Imagine living from this recognition. Someone criticizes you, and instead of collapsing into the familiar wound, you simply notice, interesting. The ego structure is activated. There are thoughts arising about worthlessness. There are sensations of shame in the body. You're not detached, you're awake. You respond from wisdom instead of reacting from wounds. You can feel compassion for the person criticizing you because you recognize they're also trapped in their ego structure, also suffering from their unconscious wounds, also mistaking their constructed self for reality. This is the ultimate rebellion. refusing to believe in the separate, wounded self, not denying it exists as a psychological structure, but seeing through its claim to be the totality of who you are. The ego will fight this recognition with everything it has because the ego survives through identification with pain, through the story of me and my suffering. But you are not the ego. You never were. So what now? How do you live from this truth instead of just understanding it intellectually? You practice. Every moment is an opportunity to disidentify, to step back from the thoughts and emotions and ask, what is aware of this? You meditate, not to achieve a special state, but to recognize the awareness that's already here, already witnessing, already free. You bring consciousness to your triggers, and instead of being the triggered person, you become the space in which triggering happens. Over time, something miraculous occurs. The dramas of life continue, but they no longer define you. Challenges still arise, but they no longer shake your foundation. People still behave unconsciously, but you no longer take it personally because you recognize there's no person here to take it personally. There's just awareness, expressing itself, experiencing itself, knowing itself through every form and formlessness. This is the final truth. You cannot be hurt because you are not a thing that can be hurt. You are the eternal witness, the unchanging awareness, the consciousness that was here before your wounds and will remain after they've healed. The pain you've carried, the suffering you've endured, the wounds you've identified with, these were never you. They were experiences moving through you. And now that you know the difference, now that you've seen through the illusion of the separate self, you are free. Not free from life's difficulties, free in the midst of them, not immune to pain, awake to what you are beyond pain, not hardened against hurt, liberated from the belief that hurt defines you. This is what it means that no one and nothing can hurt you anymore. Not because you've become invulnerable, but because you've recognized there was never anyone here to be vulnerable in the first place. Only awareness, playing at being human, remembering itself, coming home,